Hey, I'm John.
And I'm Josh.
And this is DungeonBrew, where we talk about all things homebrew.
Welcome to DungeonBrew.
Today, John and I are going to be talking about homebrew house rules that he and I have used over the last couple of decades. There's quite a few of them that we have interchanged. We picked out some of our favorites that we have used time and again. John, why don't you start us off with your spell casting rule?
All right, so yeah, the number one rule, and this is not one that I use all the time. It's one that I really enjoy in a slow moving RP heavy style campaign, and it is a rule that affects all spellcasters in the game. And basically, what it does is it removes the ability for any casting class to automatically get spells as they level up. Instead, they have to go and discover them in the world in some way. So there's a specific way that each spellcasting class does this. And I'm not going to go into detail on every single one of them, but it would be something along the lines of clerics, paladins, those divine style spellcasters like that have to go to ancient shrines and ancient temples, and they have to pray, and they have to spend time doing offerings in order for them to discover new spells. Sorcerers have to find ancient fonts of magic and do something similar where they spend time at that font absorbing the power that exists there. And wizards, eldritch knights, arcane tricksters, the arcane style casters are going to be more traditional. They're going to look for old books of magic and that type of thing. But each class has its own way of discovering magic. It requires in-game time where they spend roughly 2 hours per spell level at that given location, or studying the material that they need to in order to be able to discover new spells. And like I said, if you're using a fast-moving campaign, it's not going to work very well, but for slow-moving, RP-heavy ones, I really like that rule.
Is it fair to say this is in some of the older editions? Like, I know that Castles and Crusades really kind of lies heavy on, copying your spells down and making sure you're going and finding spells. And that's one of the things I loved about Castle and Crusades was them making you go and find your spells and put them into books. But is this type of house rule that you put into 5e something that you found in older editions or other modules?
Not necessarily, because even in BECME, clerics, their paladins didn't really, they got put in later, but the original clerics still, they had to pray in the morning in order to access their spells. And that really hasn't changed across editions. I mean, it's kind of the same thing even now in 5e. The difference being that a wizard in almost every edition previous, I'm not sure about 4e, but wizards would have to find spell books in order to get new spells. In 5th edition, they automatically get 2 spells every time they level up. So they have more access to spells. And mostly it was for that reason that, if you're running a cleric, you always have spells. If you're running a wizard, you're kind of at the DM's whim of whether or not they're going to give them to you. So, but it really is, in terms of like the time investment, wizards are really the only ones that still kind of are a holdout in terms of accessing new spells.
Yeah, I love it. So one of my favorite house rules that I do, and anyone that's played with me knows that I have a huge passion for role-playing in the game. And so I frequently give out experience points to those that engage in roleplay, if they're really highlighting their bonds, their flaws, any of their personality traits, and allowing that to come through in the course of gameplay. Now, I know that there's some things that I've read about how DMs like to reward inspiration points for characters doing those types of things in the gameplay, but I've noticed that characters oftentimes will just cling on to inspiration points because it's just like one and done, and they don't want to utilize it, so I like rewarding them with XP.
So that's interesting, because I know that, especially in 5th edition, there's kind of that movement towards leveling at the same time, and getting away from XP in general. So milestone leveling. So that characters automatically level, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever together. Do you find that, obviously since you're using XP, that's not really a big concern, but do you find that the amount of XP that a character is getting based off of their leveling rate or based off of their role play, is that creating issues in terms of balance across characters?
I've had concerns about that before. Sometimes in our current game, like, I reward XP for role-playing as a party as you guys go through things, because I think that there's what's what I'm looking for? There's almost like pressure from the group when everyone's role playing that everyone wants to be a part of that, and I've seen it
Right.
kind of fall across the board. But in terms of imbalancing the party when you're rewarding it just to certain individuals and not others, I think that it almost becomes a frustration for the characters to see their counterparts then leveling up and gaining XP for engaging with their character in a real, what's the word I'm looking for? Like essentially playing their character there in game, and so then they feel again like that encouragement to do the same in order to receive that. But I have not seen issues. It's usually not so much XP that you have a huge divide where I suddenly have like 5th level characters and 8th level characters playing.
Right.
Usually it's within 1 to 2 levels, so they're still in the same tier while they're playing the game. So it's not so much that it's impacting them, but it may allow a character to kind of have the upper hand in a battle down the road because they're a 13 instead of a 12.
Okay. That's interesting. So, I mean, since we're talking about XP, my personal method of awarding XP stems from older editions again, which I'm obsessed with them, which is providing experience for gold. So I've employed this before in games that you've played in, which is basically, and what I do is I stop awarding XP for killing monsters. There's no way to gain XP for killing monsters, and instead it has to do with how you spend your hard-won gold. And it kind of just shifts the focus. You don't necessarily have to fight with the monsters and kill them. You could barter with them and get gold. You could sneak in and steal their gold. But so long as you're getting that treasure reward and you're bringing it home, you're bringing it successfully back to town, then you can get experience points for that. And I have done other things with that where I have allowed the experience to actually be rewarded at different rates depending on how that gold ends up being spent. So it's kind of a way to keep the XP or the gold amounts from getting crazy because that can easily occur. But so you can do something where if you're spending your gold on building your stronghold, you get a certain amount of experience points. If you're spending your gold on training in new skills or new weapons or something like that, you get a different rate for that as well. So it just kind of allows for characters to, again, role play in the sense that they're spending their gold on the things that make sense for their character. And so long as they're doing that, then they're getting an XP reward for doing so.
So for clarification, I want you to kind of break this down just a little bit, because sometimes you go adventuring and it's not like hard-earned gold and silver that you're finding. You're finding objects and magical weapons and those types of things that you're going back and selling. Are you talking about getting XP for the gold that's awarded from selling those things, or is it just coinage that you're finding?
It also extends to things like gems, jewelry, art objects, that type of stuff. I usually won't reward it for things like magic items. Magic items not only have an insane gold value in general, but depending on the session that I'm running, you may not even be able to sell them because finding a buyer that can afford a 15,000 gold piece item is kind of going to be rare. So generally it is for those types of items. So once they're sold, then you get the gold for those, and that's where you get your experience points from.
So how do you handle, I'm picking on you because I know that we've run into this before. How do you handle players who hoard items that could be rewarded as experience, but then just start taking shit out of the inventory party sheet and hanging on to it instead of allowing other players to go reward that for XP potentially?
So that's really party dynamic and play style. It really is a group conversation. Generally speaking, in games like that where people want to take things from the loot pile, there's a silk cloak that just looks cool and somebody wants to be able to carry it. You take the
silk cloak, I'm going to beat the shit out of you outside.
So generally, because part of it is that it's metagamey to do that, right? Like it's to go, well, I want the XP for that. You're engaging in metagame, whereas the person who is wanting the cloak is actually engaging in RP. That it's like, oh, this character actually wants this thing. And so there's a variety of ways to handle it. It could be a group conversation where, out of game, you're talking about how you guys want to handle taking things out of the loot pile that could be XP. It could also be something where it's like technically the character is choosing to spend their gold on that item by taking it, and that is a personal pursuit that could also award XP. So they might put in 50 gold into the group pile for everybody else, and then award themselves with a cloak, where that's where they've spent their money on, basically, in order to be able to recoup some of what was there, and not only have the cloak, but also be awarded for spending their gold on it.
No, I appreciate you going down that path, because there's a lot more that goes into what you're talking about that is necessary in order to run a successful gaming session with a dynamic party, especially when they get larger and you have people focusing on different aspects of the game.
Exactly.
All right, so the fourth thing that I want to bring up, which again goes back to my role-playing focus of really appreciating role-play in the course of Dungeons & Dragons or any tabletop game, is multi-classing. And I kind of have this aversion against people that just want to power build in order to just like go through and just stomp through the world without any reason or rationale behind why their character is what they want. So if they're going to multi-class in the game, I want it to make sense for their character, who they are, and I want to see that come out through the course of gameplay. I don't want them just going and grabbing a fighter class one level and then one class of this, and then going off into this direction in order to obtain abilities, instead of having a good solid reason behind that.
Right. So multi-classing isn't something that you just do because you want to cherry pick the best abilities from every class or end up towards a power build. It's like it should be something that expresses the growth and development of a character. You know, a fighter who started out being trained as a soldier and then eventually discovering some kind of arcane artifacts and other things and drawing his interest, eventually deciding to become a wizard and multi-classing in that way. Okay.
Yeah, which is not to say that you can't have some fun with that. Just allow it to make sense and have it be a part of who your character is throughout the course of gameplay.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
Right, so I know that we've done some things with resting. Maybe that's what you're going to jump into.
Yeah.
I've seen this happen lots of ways during different games, even like video games that I play that are RPG themed. And some of them, you know, you can rest and they make you sleep for 16 hours and you're rested. Some of them, like it's just 8 hours, you're always fully rested. Some of them you rest and you don't even get all your life back in the course of that. So how have you played with this in D&D?
So it depends. I mean, the default rules for resting aren't terrible. It kind of suffers from the same thing that you find in even like 3.5 sometimes, where you have the 5-minute adventuring day. And so characters... players have a tendency to blow all of their spells and all of their abilities as quickly as possible in the first fight, and then immediately will short rest or long rest again, or attempt to, in order to be able to move on. And one of the ways that I've done this, or I've handled resting, and this is usually again in like a more of a dark fantasy, more realistic setting, is what I try to accomplish, is I allow short rests, I allow long rests. Short rests work basically the same way that they do in the normal game. Long rests work the same way, with the exception that a long rest does not allow you to regain hit points unless you also expend HD as well. So you can expend hit dice during a long rest in order to regain hit points, but you can't actually... you don't just automatically regain back your hit points the way that you're supposed to. The only way to actually regain hit points and regain hit dice is something that I introduced called a civilized rest. And the civilized rest takes 7 days. And at the end of that, you're able to regain all of your hit points and all of your HD in order to be able to go back out and adventure again. And what I found with that is it's just a way for kind of instilling that notion that being out in the wilderness is a dangerous thing. You can recover while you are out there, but even just recovering out there is not something that allows you the full mobility and the full ability that you had before. When you're coming from a civilized area where you know you're safe.
Yeah. I personally like this because it does slow down the gameplay a little bit.
Sure.
It gives your characters to do a lot of needed things while they're in town, like buying supplies and engaging with locals and speaking with NPCs, and it adds to the wholeness, I think, of the world that you're building.
And it works well with the other two rules that I had mentioned before, with spellcasting, where there's a lot of time in between adventuring. With the gold for experience, it gives you time to spend your money on personal pursuits. So it kind of works in conjunctions with those to slow down gameplay and not get caught up in the let's run to the next quest, run to the next quest, run to the next quest.
Well, it's always been weird to me that, well, I had my spleen cut out this session, but I slept for 8 hours on the forest floor, and I'm all better now.
Right. Yeah. Returning back to town in order to try and take some time to recover from that, which, it works pretty well with other options that injuries might occur.
Mm-hmm. So I have kind of like my own resting home rule or house rule that I like to use, which is probably best termed as fatigue resting. We typically look at a long rest as being 8 hours. For folks in my gameplay, that 8 hour time frame is kind of set. And if you're in the city, you have maybe a 5% chance of being interrupted. Well, if you're out in the wilds, then there's like a 20% chance of running into an encounter.
Right.
But the way that I work it is I roll the dice, and if there's something that interrupts your sleep and you engage in combat, then you're going to gain a level of exhaustion the next day while traveling. I don't allow players to we're just going to sleep in an extra 2 or 3 hours and gain back that time that we missed being out here or being engaged in combat. And I like it because it stacks on itself. So again, it almost forces players to go back to town to have a better chance of getting a good night's rest, instead of just adventuring out in the wilds day after day where your chances increase. And if you're going multiple nights without getting a full night's rest, then those levels of exhaustion stack upon each other.
Right, kind of reinforcing the danger of being away from the civilized area. And again, I think that speaks well to dark fantasy style environments, which you and I tend to prefer quite heavily in most of the games we run and the books we write, that type of thing. And if I recall correctly, when it comes to those rests, if you get interrupted, you can choose to try and do another long rest afterwards, but you still have to roll that chance, right? So you have to start over with 8 hours. So you had a 6 hour rest, but you got interrupted by an attack. You have to engage in another 8 hour rest in order to gain the benefits of long rest, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Right.
In order to get rid of that level of exhaustion, too. And if you don't achieve that, it means that you could be interrupted again in that second 8 hours and then have a second level of exhaustion.
Right.
Whatever, immediately. Yeah.
So it can be pretty dangerous, actually.
All right, so you have a rule around dynamic proficiency. You build a couple of different dynamic things, but talk about dynamic proficiency and what that is.
Well, dynamic proficiency is actually not one that I built myself. It is actually a rule that is in the DMG, and it's one that I actually like quite a bit. It is basically just replacing the stagnant +2, +3, +4, +5, +6 proficiency bonuses into die rolls. So a 2 is a D4, a 3 is a D6, and so on and so forth, which basically equals to the approximate average. The average for a D4 is 2.5. So actually, by using the D4, you have a slightly higher proficiency bonus than you would if you just get the stagnant one, but you also have the possibility of rolling that 1. And that 1 it persists, as you're going. So your average, once you get up to that +6 proficiency, which is a D12, yes, your average is 6.5, but you also have a chance of rolling a 1. But you also have a chance of rolling a 12. So it's a very interesting thing for me. I think it adds a little bit more randomness to some of those rolls. It also helps to compensate for a bad roll. So it's possible that you could roll, you have a really bad roll where you only roll a 2, you have a +4 bonus, but you roll a 12 on your proficiency dice, and all of a sudden you've turned a 2 into an 18. And I just find that to be very interesting in terms of how that plays out in game. It also works for your attack rolls, anything else that you're proficient with, and it just makes that entire mechanic a little less stagnant for me as a DM and as a player. I think it's a preference thing, I think, more than anything else. I don't know that there is probably any specific benefit, but I do enjoy it.
So you kind of threw this question at me earlier, and I think about this in the same context as how does this impact the overall party if they're all rolling a dynamic proficiency? Does it ever unbalance the party where some end up with low proficiency bonuses and other ones end up with high ones?
I mean, we are always subject to the will of the dice gods, but if you're looking at overall, you're going to find that the average is going to play out for the group and for the game and for the campaign as a whole. It's going to be a situation where it may feel like you're always rolling low on that proficiency dice. But if you were to actually take all your numbers and set them side by side, game after game, session after session, throughout the entire campaign, you're going to find that your averages are going to be pretty close to that slightly higher mark. And so you're probably thinking that it's affecting you more harshly than it really is, and everyone's probably about equal.
So another house rule that you and I both utilize is actually something that you created, and I have probably incorporated it in every session or every game that I've made since then. And that's the lingering injury chart and sanity chart that you put together,
which we talk about all the time.
We do. We don't have to go into a lot of detail about this. You can find this over on our Patreon and download it and utilize it in your own games. But essentially, it's when somebody drops to 0 or goes down in battle, they roll on this injury chart that can have additional consequences that follow throughout the course of gameplay without some intensive healing. We've since included some other house rules where they can maybe utilize HD instead of rolling on that injury chart, because the one game we had, the guy was paralyzed after the first session. He had to ride on another character's back for like the next 3 months before he was able to get his...
A 1% chance of rolling that, and he rolled it on his very first injury. It was amazing.
Yeah, it's not for the faint of heart.
No, it is not. Well, and the chart itself, if you look at it, actually has a bunch of built-in variations for how intense you want those rules to be in terms of how often you actually roll on the injury chart. By default, we do it anytime a character hits 0, right? But there are also options for critical hits, or even options where it's like as soon as you're healed, you're just back on your feet type of a thing. And it's more for RP flavor and that type of thing than actual mechanical restrictions. It really is a preference thing, I think, for the group and the DM.
And some players like it more than others.
Right. It is 100% a talk to your group before you even play it type of situation. But no, it's always been fun. We're talking about the injury charts, and so we're talking about a lot of combat things. One that I enjoy that I have employed before is the dynamic defense, which is one that I did build. And the dynamic defense is basically a way to help engage players into combat. It does slow down combat a little bit because it requires more rolls, but it does make it to where combat is not quite so one-sided. I often feel that way when I'm DMing, that I am rolling attack roll, attack roll, attack roll. And I'm always active during a combat, but for my players, sometimes it's like, well, I haven't done anything, in 5 or 10 minutes because I have to wait for my turn to come back around again. And dynamic defense is basically anytime that an attack roll is rolled against a player or a creature, they have to roll a die roll, a d20 roll, in order to determine what their AC is against that attack. And it's really easy to calculate. It's basically just taking whatever their AC is minus 10, and you roll a d20. So if you've got a orc, I don't think I'm gonna have the AC right on this, but orcs normally have a 13 AC. We'll say you would say instead that they have a 3 AC. So you roll a d20 and you add 3, and that's what their AC is for the round. They could critically fail their armor class. They could critically succeed on their armor class, and I have rules built out for how those critical successes and critical failures work when it comes to determining damage. But I find it to be a very engaging thing where suddenly your tank is up front and he's constantly having to roll his AC defense. So he's got a really good defense. He may be fine, but he can still critically fail on his own defense. So I think it's a lot of fun, honestly.
Yeah, I like the randomness that adds to battle, because I think of great battles that have occurred over the history, just of the world history, and some battles that were lost that shouldn't have been lost, or ones that were won that shouldn't have been won. And sometimes, it was a bad day for them or a great day for them in the way that things actually played out. And for me, that kind of captures that. It's just, you're just not on your mark that day. You're just not as skilled as you were, or you're just hitting every single time, letting the arrow find its mark type of thing. And it allows for that variability to just really sway battle.
Well, and like the dynamic proficiency, the average of a d20 is 10.5. So on average, your AC is actually better than it normally is. But there is that chance you roll a 1. There is that chance that you roll a critical success on a defense against a critical hit, and it's like suddenly, that critical hit isn't quite as powerful as you thought it was going to be. So it adds for more of those, gripping moments in combat, and I think it really improves it overall, even if it does slow it down a little bit. There's a little bit more math, a little bit more rolling that's involved. It works really well if you have automated rollers that can calculate that type of thing for you. In person, I would imagine it will be much slower.
So while we're talking about combat, probably my last house rule that we can talk about is my attack of opportunity house rule that I play in. And I change this up a little bit depending on what's going on, but I'll be honest, out of all of the different editions of D&D that I've played, 3.5 is probably the one that I played the most. And whether we ran this right, wrong, or otherwise, we did attacks of opportunity a lot, and I really enjoyed that in the course of gameplay. And so I like to bring that flavor back into 5e when we're playing. So one of the things that I do is anytime there's an object interaction in battle, it allows for an attack of opportunity. So if you're within 5 feet of an enemy who's, threatening you with a melee weapon, and you decide to switch weapons or reach for a potion or do something else that's an object interaction during the course of combat, it gives them an attack of opportunity on you to swing at you as you're reaching into your pouch or, sheathing this and pulling this back out or what have you.
Right.
And then the other piece that I like to add into is a critical miss. If you just whiff an attack in the course of combat and you're in close range, it's going to give an attack of opportunity of any of the monsters that are around you to respond or react to that critical miss and be able to swing at you in hopes of taking you down. And I feel like it adds to the realism of the battle a little bit in doing that. But I enjoy that attack of opportunity option in there, which I think also prevents some characters from just like rushing right into battle without having a good strategic plan.
Right, so there's a little bit more caution that goes in. Have you found that it disproportionately affects melee fighters in combat? Because the ranged fighter, if I'm back there with a bow and I'm just firing my bow, my critical misses, there's nobody nearby to attack me. But if you've got a melee fighter in close, surrounded by 4 or 5 enemies, then that critical miss could instantly mean the death of that character.
There has definitely been the concern, like you and I have talked about this being a potential hazard to them. I have noticed I'll just interject this here, is that it is extremely beneficial to your goddamn rogue who's with a bow in the back all the time, shooting and critically missing, because they're not a threat because they're able to stand back there and not have that opportunity utilized on them by the enemy. But for your strong melee fighters, I think I've seen a couple instances where it did wreak some havoc on them, but oftentimes their AC is well off enough that they're still able to dodge those things, and the variability of the rolls is so great, it's almost like having an additional person in battle that doesn't necessarily do it. It hasn't seemed to outweigh the threat yet, if that's being worded correctly. It hasn't proven an immediate danger to them, but it also forces characters to be more strategic again in how they're moving as a group. If you don't want your barbarian that's running in there to be overwhelmed by enemies in close proximity, then how are the other people positioning themselves or drawing the enemy away or doing other things so the barbarian isn't suddenly surrounded by 5 guys that are going to get an attack of opportunity when he misses? And so far, I've seen that my group has not allowed a situation to come about where it has put their frontliners in danger that's so great that it's going to drop them with this being utilized.
Right, so it's don't approach Dungeons and Dragons like World of Warcraft, where you want your frontline melee fighter to actually attract all attention. Like you want to be able to divvy that up a little bit across the group so that there's a little bit more balance there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it just maybe adds another layer of gaming in how you're approaching battles.
Right. So I will say this, since we've gotten through our list of house rules, that some of these we don't always employ all of these house rules in every single game. Some of these house rules we employ in almost every single game, like our lingering injuries chart. Other ones we've only employed once or twice, just depending on the game and the feel. And the reason why is because homebrew rules say something about the setting, they say something about the campaign. And if you want that slow-moving, methodical, role-play heavy campaign, then including some of these are going to be beneficial. If you want a fast-paced, nail-biting type situation where you're just heroic warriors running through from fight to fight to fight, then you may not want to include all of these. You may not want to include any of them, because many of them are focused on realism, dark fantasy, and actually slowing down the game a little bit. So pay attention to the house rules that you're employing. Pay attention to the way that a house rule can affect gameplay. Make sure that your players are understanding how those homebrew rules affect gameplay. And if you find that a homebrew rule is not affecting the game in the way that you thought it would, or that there's something else going on with it, make sure you're having a conversation to figure out how you can make changes or add or remove or do whatever is necessary to make the game the way that you and your players want to play it.
Yeah, great advice. I have nothing to add to that. Yeah, get the hell out of here.
DungeonBrew.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with us today. Please check out some of the stuff we're doing. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, join us on our Discord, or go and watch us stream on Twitch, where we're at 4 or 5 days a week. All the links are down below. We look forward to hearing from you.
DungeonBrew.
All right. Whatever number we're on now.
I don't know.
6?
I'll put numbers at the bottom when
Right. The numbers at the bottom.
the numbers will be there.
DungeonBrew.